The desert doesn't care if you're brave. It doesn't care if you prayed before you left camp or if you kissed your wife goodbye. When the sun rises over those red stone cliffs and your canteen runs dry, the only thing that matters is whether you've got enough stubborn left in you to see another dawn. This is the story of a man who found out just how much a human being can lose and still refuse to lie down. His name was Thomas Garrett, and in the spring of 1876 he was nobody special. Just another prospector chasing rumors of silver through the Apache territories of southern Arizona, riding a roan mare that had seen better years and carrying dreams bigger than his saddlebags could hold. He was 28 years old, lean as a whip from months on the trail, with sun-darkened skin and eyes that still held on to hope despite everything the frontier had already taken from him. Thomas had left his claim near Prescott 3 weeks earlier, following whispers he'd heard in a saloon about a canyon where Mexican miners had supposedly found a vein of silver thick as a man's arm. The old-timer who told the story had drawn a crude map on the back of a wanted poster, his whiskey-shaking hand tracing lines through mountain ranges and across dry washes that all looked the same once you were out there under that merciless sky. The first mistake was believing the map. The second was riding out alone. For 2 weeks, Thomas pushed deeper into country that grew stranger and more hostile with each passing mile. The mountains became jagged teeth on the horizon, the valleys between them filled with dust and stone and plants that seemed to exist just to draw blood. He rationed his water carefully, refilling at every seep and spring, but the distances between water sources kept growing longer, and the sun kept burning hotter, and that silver canyon remained always one more day's ride ahead. On the morning of his 15th day out from Prescott, Thomas woke to find his mare standing three-legged, her right foreleg swollen to twice its normal size. He'd hobbled her the night before in a patch of bunch grass near what passed for a creek, just a trickle of brown water between two rock faces. Sometime in the dark hours she'd stepped wrong or been bitten by something, and now she could barely put weight on the leg. He spent that day doing everything he knew to do. He cold-packed the leg with wet sand, wrapped it in strips torn from his extra shirt, walked her slowly to see if the swelling would work itself out. But the mare was finished. By evening she couldn't stand without trembling, and Thomas knew the decision that was coming. A man could argue with himself about a lot of things on the frontier, but some truths were hard as granite. The mare couldn't walk and he couldn't carry her, and leaving her alive to die slowly from thirst or predators was a cruelty he wouldn't allow. When the sun dropped below the canyon rim and the shadows grew long and purple across the rocks, Thomas Garrett did what had to be done with his rifle and a whispered apology, and then he was alone in a way he'd never been alone before. He spent that night beside a fire built from dead mesquite, trying to think clearly about the situation he was in. The mare had carried everything except what he wore and what he could fit in his pockets. His bedroll, his extra ammunition, his cooking pot, his supply of jerky and hardtack, all of it strapped to a dead horse he couldn't burden himself with. He salvaged what he could. He filled his canteen from the muddy trickle. He stuffed his pockets with ammunition and the last of his coffee. He rolled up his spare pair of socks and tied them to his belt. And at first light, with his rifle over his shoulder and his boots already raising blisters, Thomas started walking west. West because that's where Prescott lay, somewhere beyond the heat shimmer and the stone. West because going forward toward a silver canyon he'd never find seemed like madness now, and turning back was the only sane choice left. The first 3 days of walking weren't the worst. Thomas still had water. He still had hope. The country was brutal, all exposed rock and scattered thorn brush, but he was young and strong and he'd been through hard times before. He told himself that if he kept a steady pace and didn't panic, he could cover enough ground to reach one of the mining camps he'd passed on the way out. 20 miles a day if he pushed it. Maybe 15 if the terrain was bad. A week, 10 days at most, and he'd see cook fires and hear human voices again. But the desert had other ideas. On the 4th day his canteen ran dry around noon, and he didn't find water that night. He'd been aiming for a spring marked on the old-timer's map, a place where the Mexican miners supposedly camped, but when he reached the spot at dusk, there was nothing but a dry depression in the rocks and the white crust of old mineral deposits. He dug down with his hands until his fingers bled, hoping for damp sand, finding only more dust. The 5th day was when fear started creeping in around the edges of his mind. His tongue had swollen thick in his mouth. His lips cracked and bled. Every breath felt like inhaling sand, and the sun overhead was a physical weight pressing him down. He kept walking because stopping meant dying, but the landscape around him had become a fevered dream of repetition. The same red rocks, the same dead brush, the same empty sky. That night, he tried to find moisture by cutting open a barrel cactus, the way he'd heard it could be done. But the pulp inside was bitter and made him retch, and he lost more water than he gained. He lay on his back in the dark, staring up at stars that seemed close enough to touch, and he thought about his wife Rachel back in Illinois. She'd begged him not to go west. She'd said the frontier would kill him the same way it killed her father. Thomas had kissed her forehead and promised he'd come back with enough money to buy the farm she wanted. That promise felt very far away now. The days began to blur together. 6, 7, 8, he lost count. Time became something measured only by the sun's position and the growing weakness in his legs. He'd stopped sweating. That was a bad sign, he knew, but knowing it didn't help. His body was consuming itself, burning through muscle and fat to keep him moving. His mind started playing tricks. He'd see water on the horizon, shimmering and blue, only to reach the spot and find more rocks. He'd hear voices calling his name, turn expecting to see riders, and find nothing but wind. Somewhere around the 10th day, Thomas stopped believing he would make it. The realization came quietly, without drama. He was resting in the shade of a rock overhang during the worst heat of afternoon when he understood that he was going to die out here. No one knew exactly where he'd gone. The map he'd followed was nonsense. His body would turn to leather and bone under this sun, and eventually someone might find his remains, or they might not, and either way he'd just be another forgotten man who'd chased a dream too far into the wasteland. But knowing he was going to die didn't make him lie down. That was the strange thing Thomas discovered about himself in those days. Even after hope was gone, something else remained. Not courage exactly, and not stubbornness, though there was plenty of that. It was something more basic, a refusal written into his bones that wouldn't let him quit while breath still moved in his chest. So he kept walking. He walked through days when the heat made the horizon waver like water. He walked through nights when the cold made him shake so hard he thought his teeth would crack. He walked after his boots fell apart and his feet left bloody prints on the stone. He walked after his rifle became too heavy to carry and he left it propped against a rock like a grave marker. He walked after his mind began to fracture and he couldn't remember his wife's face clearly anymore, couldn't remember the names of his brothers, couldn't remember anything except the simple animal imperative to keep moving. 2 weeks in, maybe 3, Thomas found water. Not a spring or a creek, just a depression in a slab of rock that had collected runoff from some brief rain he'd slept through. The water was green with algae and tasted of minerals and decay, but he drank it anyway, lying on his belly and sucking it up like a dog. Made him sick. He spent the next day vomiting and shaking with fever, but some of the water stayed down, and it bought him a few more days of life. The hallucinations grew worse. He walked alongside his dead father for an entire afternoon, having long conversations about crops and weather. He saw Rachel standing on ridgetops, her dress bright as snow against the red rock, waving for him to hurry. He saw cities in the clouds, heard music in the wind, watched angels and demons fight battles in the dust devils that spun across the flats. But underneath the madness, that stubborn core of him kept counting steps, kept noting landmarks, kept pushing west. There were moments of terrible clarity. Times when the fever broke and his mind sharpened and he could see his situation with brutal honesty. He was a walking corpse. His skin had burned and peeled and burned again. His body was consuming itself. His feet were ruined. He hadn't eaten anything but a few bitter roots and 2 lizards he'd managed to catch and eat raw in more than 20 days. Maybe longer. Time had become strange. During one of those clear moments, Thomas sat on a flat rock and took inventory of himself. He could still think, mostly. He could still walk barely. His hands still worked, though they shook constantly. His eyes still saw, though his vision had begun to narrow into a tunnel. By any reasonable measure, he should have been dead already. The fact that he wasn't felt less like luck and more like a cosmic joke. But he stood up anyway. He kept walking. The country began to change. The rock formations grew familiar in ways he couldn't quite place. A particular shaped butte on the horizon. A wash that curved in a pattern he'd seen before. Thomas's rational mind tried to tell him these were just more hallucinations, but something deeper recognized the land. He was in country he'd passed through on his way out. Which meant Prescott was reachable. Maybe. On a day he later couldn't number, when the sun was high and hot and his shadow was a small dark pool beneath his feet, Thomas Garrett saw smoke on the horizon. thin and gray against the blue sky. He stared at it for a long time, waiting for it to disappear like all the other mirages. It didn't disappear. It rose steady and straight, the kind of smoke that came from a campfire or a chimney. He walked toward it. Not quickly because his body wouldn't allow quickly anymore, but with purpose. Each step was negotiated carefully with legs that felt like rotted wood. The smoke stayed real. As he got closer, he began to see the source. A small ranch house built in a shallow valley, with corrals and a windmill turning slowly in the breeze. Thomas tried to call out when he got near, but his voice was gone. His throat had sealed to a rasp that couldn't carry. So he walked into the yard, past a startled dog that barked once and then fell silent, and he made it as far as the porch steps before his legs finally gave out. He came awake in a bed which seemed impossible. There were walls around him, a ceiling above, curtains on a window showing sunset light. A woman was pressing a damp cloth to his forehead, older, weathered, with kind eyes and capable hands. When she saw him looking at her, she smiled. "Well," she said softly, "welcome back to the living." Her name was Margaret Hartley, and the ranch belonged to her and her husband Edward. They'd found Thomas collapsed on their porch 3 days earlier, more dead than alive, burned and bleeding and so dehydrated his skin was like paper. Margaret had seen men in bad shape before. The frontier didn't suffer fools gently, but she told Thomas later that she'd never seen anyone as far gone as he was who still had a pulse. They fed him broth at first, just a few spoonfuls at a time because his stomach had shrunk to nothing. They cleaned and bandaged his feet, which were masses of blisters and infection. They kept him in bed while his body remembered how to be human again instead of just a walking machine powered by stubbornness. It took Thomas 2 weeks to be able to stand without help. Another week before he could walk around the ranch without exhausting himself. The Hartleys asked him no questions except what they needed to know to help him heal. Edward remarked once that Thomas must have one hell of a story, judging by the state he'd arrived in. Thomas just nodded and let it be. During his recovery, Thomas did a lot of thinking. About the man he'd been when he left Prescott, chasing silver and dreams. About the man he'd become in those 40 days in the desert, when everything was stripped away except the raw will to survive. About what it meant that he'd kept walking even after hope died. He thought about Rachel back in Illinois, waiting for a letter that hadn't come. He thought about the foolishness of following a drunk's map into Apache country alone. He thought about his mare, and the moment he'd had to put her down, and how that had been the end of one story and the beginning of another. When Thomas was finally strong enough to travel, Edward Hartley offered to drive him into Prescott in his wagon. They left on a cool morning in early summer, the sky clear and blue, the mountains green with seasonal rains that had come and gone while Thomas was recovering. As they rolled into town, Thomas looked at the familiar buildings and dusty streets and felt like he'd been gone for years instead of months. He sent a telegram to Rachel that same day. Just 4 words, "I'm alive. Coming home." Before he left Arizona, Thomas went to the land office and formally abandoned his claim near Prescott. He sold his mining equipment to a dealer for pennies on the dollar. He bought a ticket on the stage heading east, back toward the world he'd left behind. On his last night in town, he sat on the porch of the boarding house and watched the sun go down over the mountains. Those same mountains he'd crossed chasing silver, those same ranges that had nearly become his grave. They were beautiful in the dying light, he had to admit. Beautiful and terrible and utterly indifferent to the small struggles of men. Thomas Garrett never told anyone the full story of those 40 days. When people asked about the scars on his feet or the way his eyes sometimes got distant and strange, he'd just say he'd gotten lost for a while and leave it at that. Some things didn't need explaining. Some lessons were too personal to share. But he carried those days with him for the rest of his life. In the way he never took water for granted again, never filled a cup without feeling grateful. In the way he approached every hardship afterward with the knowledge that if he could survive 40 days alone in the desert with no water, no horse and no hope, he could survive anything. He made it back to Illinois by August. Rachel was waiting on the porch when he came up the road, and when she saw him, she ran. He caught her in his arms and held her while she cried, and he told her the only thing that mattered, "I'm here. I'm not leaving again." They bought their farm after all, though it took years of hard work and saving. Thomas never got rich. He never found his silver canyon. But he learned something more valuable out there in that merciless country under that brutal sun. He learned that hope is a fine thing to have, but it's not what keeps you alive when the worst comes. What keeps you alive is simpler and fiercer than hope. It's the refusal to quit. The stubborn insistence on taking one more step, and then another, even when every reason says you should lie down and let the desert have you. It's the thing inside a human being that says no to the darkness, over and over again, until the darkness finally blinks first. Thomas Garrett lived to be 73 years old. He died in his own bed, on his own land, surrounded by children and grandchildren who'd heard bits and pieces of his story over the years but never quite grasped what he'd survived. On his gravestone, beneath his name and the years of his life, Rachel had them carved just 4 words. He kept on walking. And if you listen close on quiet nights, when the wind comes down from the high country and the stars are bright overhead, you might still hear his footsteps echoing across that endless desert. The sound of a man who refused to die, the sound of one more step, and then another, until finally he made it home.